The winter wind bit through the barracks like a living thing, sharp and unforgiving. Lydia could feel the cold creeping into her bones, her thin coat offering little protection against the frozen air. Yet, as she shuffled alongside the others, her feet numb from hours of forced labor, it wasn't the cold that weighed most heavily on her. It was the names that she had memorized, the names that would soon vanish forever if she didn't do something. Auschwitz, to the outside world, was just a name, a place on a map. But here, inside its barbed wire and walls, it was a machine built to erase everything: identity, dignity, and humanity. The Nazis' ambition was monstrous, not just to exterminate people, but to erase the memory of their existence entirely. But for Lydia, in the darkest corners of this desolate place, the names meant everything. They were her defiance, her small act of rebellion against a system bent on obliterating the past. Lydia wasn't an extraordinary person. She wasn't a fighter, nor a leader, nor even someone who had been particularly rebellious before the war. But the moment she was thrust into this nightmare, something inside her shifted. She became a silent witness, a keeper of the stories that no one else had the strength, or perhaps the desire, to remember. As a young woman, she had been forced to enter Auschwitz with her family, the familiar faces of her parents and siblings now ghosts in her memory. She had been separated from them upon arrival. It wasn't the brutality of the physical labor that hurt her the most. It was the psychological toll, the knowledge that the names of so many would vanish without a trace. One day, in the dead of winter, the camp commandant issued a new order. Every prisoner arriving at Auschwitz must be cataloged. The names of the incoming people were written on paper, stored in files, but those files were not meant to be preserved. They were meant to be destroyed. There would be no memorials, no records, just nameless faces, bodies to be disposed of like refuse. The Nazis knew that to erase the very essence of a person was the ultimate power, and they took great care to ensure that no one would be remembered. But Lydia had seen enough. She couldn't stand the thought of these people being forgotten. For weeks, she had been gathering scraps of paper, ink smuggled from the kitchen, anything she could use to write down the names she had heard whispered in the halls. Some were from people she had seen briefly, others she had known from her hometown before the war had taken everything from her. But the most important ones were the names of those who had not arrived yet, the ones who would soon be brought in, forced off trains, stripped of their belongings, and sent to the gas chambers. She memorized every name she could. Sometimes it was simply a first name, a fleeting glance at a face before it disappeared forever. Other times it was a family name, one that would carry the weight of an entire history. Each name was a world unto itself. And in a place where the very concept of individuality had been erased, Lydia had chosen to preserve it, quietly, secretly. She had no illusions that these names would ever be seen by anyone else. But in her heart, they were more than just names. They were people. They were lives that had mattered. There were risks, of course. In the beginning, she was careful. No one could know what she was doing. She hid the pieces of paper under her mattress, inside her shoes, sometimes even sewn into the seams of her coat. But as the days wore on and the death toll grew, she realized that the list had become too vast. It was no longer just a few names. It was hundreds, then thousands. It was the entire camp. Every person she passed on the way to the barracks became someone she had to remember. Every face she glimpsed in the corner of the yard was a name that had to be preserved. Her mind became a vault, storing each name, each face. The more she remembered, the heavier the burden grew. But she couldn't stop. To forget was to surrender. To forget was to give in to the darkness that consumed everything. She had to resist. She had to hold on to this small piece of dignity. In a place where everything, her own body, her own soul, was being used for someone else's purpose, the names were the only thing that belonged to her. Lydia's task was made even more difficult by the brutal conditions of the camp. Starvation was a constant companion, and the threat of punishment loomed over everyone. Guards patrolled the barracks like vultures, always looking for an excuse to lash out. Sometimes just a glance in the wrong direction would lead to a beating. But it was the constant surveillance that made Lydia feel most trapped. There were moments when she couldn't even move without fear of being caught. It was these moments that made her want to give up, to abandon her effort and save herself. But then she would think of the names, the faces she had seen on the trains, the terrified eyes of those who had been told they were going to be processed for work. And she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't let them be forgotten. Every evening, after the labor, after the long hours of waiting for the next command, Lydia would sit alone in the darkened barracks, her body exhausted, her mind still sharp. She would whisper the names to herself, each one a prayer, each one a promise. She would close her eyes and imagine their faces, her mind racing to remember the details. The way one man had laughed nervously as the train doors opened, the soft sobs of a woman who had been separated from her child, the brave smile of a young boy who had tried to hide his fear behind a mask of courage. The days bled into one another, a blur of cold, hunger, and fear. Lydia grew thinner, her strength waning, but she never stopped memorizing the names. The prisoners around her whispered about the growing rebellion in the camp, the underground movements, the small acts of sabotage that had begun to challenge the Nazis' grip on power. But Lydia didn't care about that. She didn't need to be part of a resistance movement to know that she was making a difference. Her defiance was quieter, but no less powerful. She was keeping the memory alive, even when the world had turned its back on them. She was giving these people the one thing the Nazis couldn't take away, their names. But as time wore on, it became harder to keep track. The names blurred, mixed together in her mind like a swirling fog. She began to worry. What if she forgot someone? What if, in the chaos of the days, one life slipped through the cracks? It was a fear that haunted her, that gnawed at her during the long, sleepless nights. But still she pressed on. She knew that this list, this quiet rebellion, was the only way to ensure that the people around her would not vanish from history. And then came the day when the commandant ordered all lists of names to be burned. The Nazis were preparing to evacuate the camp, to move the prisoners to another location. They had learned from their mistakes, destroy the evidence, bury the truth. It was a final act of suppression, a final act of erasure. Lydia's heart sank when she heard the news. The name she had fought so hard to preserve would be destroyed in an instant. But Lydia refused to let them die in the flames. She knew she couldn't save the list, not from the Nazis. But she could carry it with her in her mind. She could remember. The burden of memory was not something she could abandon. As long as she lived, the names would live. And so, as the camp descended into chaos, Lydia held on to what she could. The names, the faces, the stories. They would not be forgotten. And for the first time since she had been thrust into this nightmare, Lydia allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world would remember too. The sound of boots pounding against the cold, hard ground reverberated through the air as the camp's last few weeks descended into frenzy. The Nazis, now aware that the Allies were only days away, scrambled to erase all traces of their unspeakable crimes. It wasn't just the gas chambers, the crematoriums, or the barracks that were in danger of being exposed. It was the very record of the lives they had destroyed. Every file, every scrap of paper, every name written down in the camp's dark heart was now a target. The prisoners had become expendable, but the evidence of their existence could still be used against them. The list that Lydia had carefully compiled, painstakingly memorized, and hidden in the most secret corners of her being, was now under direct threat. There had been whispers around the camp for days now. A wave of transport was about to arrive, an order to evacuate, and those who had somehow survived were to be relocated to a new camp. Some said it was a final solution for those who were left, one last sweep to wipe away any survivors, to leave no evidence behind. Others spoke of a hurried march, to take them farther into the heart of the Reich where the horrors would be buried, never to be uncovered. Lydia had no illusions anymore. The Nazis weren't interested in prisoners who could still be used for forced labor. They had no use for the weak, the sick, or the elderly. The true aim of the evacuation wasn't to relocate, it was to silence, to make sure that there would be no voices left to tell the truth when the war ended. Lydia's heart raced as she moved through the barracks, her mind spiraling with a mix of dread and defiance. She knew what would happen next. The camp's files would be destroyed. The names she had kept safe for so long would be consumed by fire. It was as though her entire world was being dismantled before her eyes, piece by piece. The thought of those names, those faces erased, obliterated, made her stomach twist with an emotion she couldn't name. The quiet rebellion she had carried for so long was about to be crushed in the most brutal way imaginable. The names would disappear like smoke in the wind. But Lydia couldn't let it happen. She couldn't stand idly by and allow everything she had fought for to vanish into the night. She had memorized hundreds of names, and each one represented a life, a person, a family who deserved to be remembered. The list wasn't just a record. It was a testament to their dignity. A piece of humanity in a place where humanity had been so viciously torn apart. Lydia had known from the beginning that this would be a dangerous task. The odds had always been stacked against her, but now, as the threat of destruction loomed larger, her resolve had hardened. She could not, would not, allow the Nazis to succeed in their final act of erasure. She knew what they were capable of. They had burned books, silenced voices, and eradicated entire communities. And now, as their empire crumbled around them, they were determined to do the same with the names. She had only one chance to act, one small window of opportunity in the chaos to preserve what she could. Lydia's mind raced as she thought through her options. She could try to smuggle the list out of the camp, perhaps hidden in her clothing or sewn into the lining of her coat. But that was risky. The guards were suspicious, and anyone caught attempting to hide something would be punished severely. She could try to bury it somewhere, perhaps under the barracks or in the snow, but that was equally dangerous. The Nazis were not known for their patience, and any sign of resistance would be met with swift and brutal punishment. And so, as she walked through the barracks, clutching the name she had memorized like a treasure, Lydia came to a grim realization. The list, the record of the lives she had preserved, would have to be destroyed. There was no way around it, but there was still a choice to make. How would she let it go? How could she erase the evidence without erasing the memory of what those names represented? The decision she made would mark her forever. She didn't hesitate. In the dead of night, when the camp was at its quietest, when the guards had retreated to their posts and the prisoners were huddled in their makeshift beds, Lydia slipped away from the barracks. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate danger, to slip through the cracks of the Nazi system unnoticed. The cold night air cut through her, but she barely noticed it as she made her way to the furnace. The furnace was where it all ended. It was the place where the evidence of death, the bodies, the ash, the scraps of lives, were consumed in the fire. Lydia had seen it many times before, the flames licking at the remnants of humanity, the smoke rising like a twisted prayer to the sky. But tonight, the furnace would have a different purpose. Tonight, it would be the vessel that destroyed the one thing that the Nazis couldn't take away, the names. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the furnace. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but there was no turning back. This was her only chance. She pulled the small bundle of paper from her coat, feeling the familiar folds under her fingertips. The names were all there, written in careful script, each one a life preserved in her mind. Each one a tiny rebellion against the machine of death that surrounded them. With trembling hands, she opened the bundle, staring at the names one last time. For a brief moment, she felt as though she were holding something sacred. These were the people who had trusted her, who had unknowingly given her the task of carrying their memory into the future. She had promised them that they wouldn't be forgotten. But now, as the flames crackled in front of her, Lydia knew she had no choice. She tossed the bundle of paper into the fire. The heat was immediate, and the smoke rose in a dark plume, curling into the night sky. Lydia watched as the names, her names, disappeared into the flames, curling and blackening as they were consumed. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. The wind, the noise of the camp, the shouting of the guards, it all faded away. It was just her, alone with the fire, watching as the evidence of so much pain and so much loss vanished in front of her eyes. The flame took the names, just as it had taken so many lives. But even as the paper disintegrated into ash, Lydia knew that she hadn't erased the memory of these people. The names may have burned, but the stories they represented, their lives, their courage, their love, could never be consumed by the fire. No matter how much the Nazis tried to destroy them, the names would live on in her memory. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. As the last of the paper turned to ash and the flames began to die down, Lydia stood there for a long time, lost in the smoke and the darkness. She couldn't have known what would happen next. The Nazis would continue their march of terror, and the camp would soon be liberated by the Allies. But Lydia knew that, for her, the struggle wasn't over. The names she had memorized would never truly be gone. They would live in the hearts of those who remembered. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough. The war was over, but the scars it left on the world and on Lydia's soul had not healed. The rubble of Europe had barely begun to settle when the trials began. The Nuremberg trials, a farce for some, a moment of justice for others. The entire world was watching, waiting to see if those responsible for the horrors of the Holocaust would finally pay for their crimes. But to Lydia, it all seemed like a hollow echo of what had really happened, a show to appease the guilty and the innocent alike. The Nazis may have been defeated, but the memory of what they had done was still buried, still silenced, by a system too eager to move on. The list, the names, the faces, none of it had been preserved in the way it deserved. History had already moved on, and the memories of those who had perished seemed to slip through the cracks of the world's collective conscience. Lydia had been one of the lucky ones. She had survived, but survival, in this case, didn't mean healing. The survivors who had returned to the world, who had fled the ashes of Auschwitz and the other camps, had no place to go. The world had become a strange, alien place, too bright, too noisy, too full of people who hadn't experienced the hell that was their reality. How could they understand? How could anyone who hadn't stood in the shadow of the gas chambers or felt the weight of endless death know what it was like? For Lydia, the years after the war had been a constant struggle to piece herself back together, to find some semblance of purpose in a world that had forgotten the true cost of the war. The names she had memorized were still with her, haunting her every step, but she couldn't tell anyone about them. Who would listen? Who would believe that a young woman, one of millions, could carry the memory of the names of those who had died, those who had been forgotten by history? She couldn't go to a historian, couldn't sit before a court and demand that the world remember the faces she had seen, because in a way, the world had already decided that it would forget.